Jin-Woo took a deep breath and said the magic word, Araz. This was supposed to activate his shadow extraction skill, but nothing happened. He frowned, confused. Before he could try again, a chime sounded, and a message popped up. You've reached the limit of shadows you can extract. To get more shadows, you need to release some of your shadow soldiers back into the void. Remember, once they're gone, you can't bring them back. Jin-Woo nodded. He had read something about this before in his skill info. Right now, he had 30 shadow soldiers, which was the maximum he could have at one time. He turned around, thinking about what to do next. The shadow soldiers had followed him silently, as quiet as ghosts, which made sense because they were made of shadows. He couldn't figure out when they started following him, but there they were, standing at attention like loyal guards. The system had told him that to free Igris's shadow, he would have to let one of his soldiers go, but the thought of losing even one of them made him feel uneasy. These soldiers weren't just random shadows, they were his team, his protectors. How could he possibly choose which one to release? It didn't feel right. Jin-Woo had only known them for a few minutes, but he already felt a strange bond with his new troops. As he scanned the group, names and levels popped up one after another. Shadow Infantry LV. One regular rank repeated over, and over each soldier was exactly the same. No surprises there, they all shared the same roots, after all. But then something caught his eye. Near the back of the group, 3 figures stood out in a crowd. They weren't dressed like the others. In fact, they wore robes that made them look way more important than the rest. Jin-Woo's gaze locked onto them. Shadow Mage LV. One elite rank flashed before him. He muttered to himself, the pieces falling into place. These 3 had to be the mages who controlled that massive iron golem earlier. No wonder they looked different. They had also become undead under his command, 27 infantry soldiers and 3 mages. Being rare gave you an edge, which was why he spared the mages since there were so few of them. In the end, he chose a soldier standing nearby. Release, Jin-Woo said softly, as the soldier dissolved into black smoke that vanished into the still air, leaving no trace behind. Jin-Woo glanced at the empty spot where the soldier had stood, looking sorry about what he'd done, before turning his attention back to Igris. He had given up one of his valuable team members to turn Igris into a shadow. This better be worth it. He didn't waste any time and tried the extraction right away. Araz, he said. Igris's shadow, which had been perfectly still before, suddenly twitched and quivered like it was waking up from a deep sleep. Let's go. He clenched his fists tightly, feeling hopeful about what might happen next. Beginning shadow extraction attempt. Attempting to extract, what would Igris look like as a shadow? Jin-Woo's palms were sweaty as he waited nervously. Then, a message popped up, and an alarm blared like snapping metal. Shadow extraction has failed. Gums. Jin-Woo's eyes widened in shock. You have 2 attempts remaining. Asru let out a sigh of relief when he saw he still had a couple more chances. The instructions had warned that the harder the target, the higher the chance of failure, but it was still super frustrating when it actually happened. This was his first failure and it hit him hard, like a punch to the gut. It felt like there were only so many chances left. He had 2 more shots. If he blew both, would he end up like that soldier he'd lost? Thinking about the worst-case scenario made his stomach twist with worry. Jin-Woo shook his head, trying to shake off the fear. Let's not be so negative, he told himself. Just think positive. Ask, and you'll get what you want. Jin-Woo thought, hopefully as he tried extracting the shadow again. He was nervous but excited. What if it worked this time? Arise, he commanded, his heart racing with anticipation. But tink, the extraction failed once more. Shadow extraction has failed. The message read, you have 1 attempt remaining. Jin-Woo groaned in frustration. Igris was just as annoying dead as it had been alive. He hadn't wanted to believe he might fail twice. But, wow. Jin-Woo let out a deep breath and shook his head. This wasn't going as planned at all. This was it, his final chance. No more retreats, no more do-overs. He shut his eyes and took a deep breath to clear his mind. Maybe everything depended on luck now, or maybe he just wasn't desperate enough yet. He opened his eyes slowly. The mist rising from Igris seemed to hum with an urgent energy, like it was calling out to him, begging for help. Jin-Woo's expression turned serious. He stretched out his hand like he was reaching for something invisible in the air. Erase, he said. He didn't mean to sound so intense. It just came out that way. His voice echoed through the room, sending a chill down his spine. Then, out of nowhere, a spooky moan filled the air. Audiobook, as a sharp gust of wind swept through the room, making everything feel eerie. Jin-Woo's eyes widened in shock. Is this really happening? The same thing happened when Jin-Woo's soldiers first came out of the shadows. They let out a long, eerie moan that sent chills down his spine. Hopla! Just as he expected. Once the moaning stopped, a long black arm slowly emerged from the darkness. The moment the hand touched the ground, a message appeared in front of him. Shadow extraction successful. Jin-Woo let out a triumphant yell. Yes, he felt an extra rush of excitement, because this came after 2 failed attempts. Finally it had worked. And there was even more awesome news. Jin-Woo couldn't believe what he was seeing. A message flashed before his eyes. The Shadow Monarch has awakened the dead's fighting spirit. Then another popped up. Shadow enhancement successful. His eyes widened as he read the next one. The shadow will start with a base level of 7. Wait, does that mean a soldier's starting level can be higher than 1? Jin-Woo muttered to himself, stunned. Just like in the message, a newly spawned knight stood before him. The label floating above its head clearly showed it was level 7. Jin-Woo let out a startled hun, as he took in the sight of Igris, who looked exactly as he remembered, complete with that distinctive long mane on his helmet, elegantly designed armor, and a majestic flowing cloak. The only difference was that the armor, once blood red, had turned as black as coal. Everything else looked exactly the same. Jin-Woo could have sworn it was Igris brought back to life. But this time, there was no anger or hatred in Igris's eyes. Instead, the new Igris just stood there quietly, waiting for Jin-Woo's commands. Jin-Woo's heart thudded in his chest like a drum boom. Boom. Cussy stared at the dark figure in front of him. Jin-Woo beamed with pride as he gazed at his creation. Igris, but something felt off. His eyes wandered up to where the name should be, only to find question marks instead. The rank was different too, which caught him by surprise even after considering the upgrades. Igris didn't look like an ordinary soldier. It was as if the system had read Jin-Woo's mind and made him something extraordinary. Ping! A message popped up with perfect timing. You can give names to shadow soldiers who are knight rank or higher. The names you give will stay until the shadow is released. Please choose a name. A name. Jin-Woo was caught off guard by this sudden request, but then he smiled, feeling relieved. He remembered that this creature already had a name. The message kept flashing like it was in a hurry. Jin-Woo needed to name the soldier, but he hesitated. When the words finally came out of his mouth, they felt a bit awkward. He grised the blood. He stopped short. If he gave the knight this name, he'd have to say the whole thing every time he wanted to call him. That could get pretty inconvenient. Just thinking about it made Jin-Woo cringe. He imagined saying something super cheesy like, "You shall be known as," dramatic pause, "Sir Awesome Pants the Great." No way. He decided to keep it simple. Igris, he said finally. Would you like to use Igris's? A voice asked. Sure, as soon as Jin-Woo agreed. The question marks floating above the knight's head were replaced with his new name. Igris LV, 7 knight rank. Even though Jin-Woo was reusing the same name his minion had before, he couldn't help but feel proud of what he'd just done. It felt like Igris was all his. Like a soldier just for him. Jin-Woo turned around. And there they were, 29 shadow soldiers waiting for his orders. 30 in total, but still a small crew. Maybe it's because his shadow extraction skill isn't super strong yet. Or maybe he needs to boost his intelligence stat. One thing's clear, his army will keep growing. This wasn't just any ordinary army. No skeletons or rotting corpses here. This was an army of shadows, and now there was only one big question left. What would he do with it? Man, how could Jin-Woo go anywhere with these guys tagging along? Just thinking about it gave him a headache. Seriously, whether they were skeletons or shadows didn't matter. Walking down the street with them would definitely draw attention. And that wasn't even the worst part. This was way beyond what an average awakened being could handle. He'd be under constant watch, or worse. People might demand he break up his shadow army. Jin-Woo, the head of the Hunter Association's surveillance team, was exactly the type of guy who would show up every day, causing a big fuss. Just imagining it made Jin-Woo frustrated. That's probably why he had that other skill. He opened the skills window again. Shop exclusive skills. Active skill. Shadow extraction Lev 1 passive skill. Hack shadow storage LV 1. There it was, shadow storage. The skill he'd glanced over before. Just by the name Shadow Storage LVU, Jin-Woo knew exactly what it was for. This skill was perfect for him. It was a special ability just for his job. And the best part, it didn't cost any mana to use. Here's how it worked. Jin-Woo could absorb shadow soldiers into his own shadow, keeping them stored there like secret weapons. Whenever he needed them, he could call them back out. And if he changed his mind, he could suck them back into his shadow in an instant. Right now though, he hadn't stored any yet, 0 out of 20. Jin-Woo nodded to himself. He'd been right. The name had given it away, and the skill was everything he hoped it would be. But here's the catch, something he never saw coming. He could create shadows, but storing them was another story. The problem: space. He had 30 shadows, but his storage max was 20. That meant saying goodbye to 10 of them. Ouch. No matter which finger you bite, it hurts just the same. Getting rid of one soldier was tough enough, but now Jin-Woo had to let go of 10. His heart felt heavy as he looked at his troops. Of course Igris, with his high knight rank, was safe. The 3 special mage soldiers were also spared. It was the regular infantry soldiers who were the most expendable. Last time, Jin-Woo had released a soldier close to him, so this time he chose 10 from the back. He felt sorry for them, and hoped they would find peace. With a soft whoosh, the soldiers vanished into dust. It didn't bug him as much this time. Maybe that's what happened when you got used to saying goodbye. Whatever the reason, Jin-Woo glanced one last time at his remaining ranks before flipping on shadow storage. The soldiers vanished like ice melting in the sun, their shapes fading away until they formed a dark pool around his feet. And now they're part of my shadow. Jin-Woo muttered to himself, amazed. Just as he'd been told, the soldiers had slipped into his own shadow, becoming one with it. Everything ended super fast. His entire army disappeared in an instant, gone without leaving any clue behind. Even though I saw it happen right before my eyes, it still felt unbelievable. He stared at his shadow in total amazement. Suddenly, like the system was waiting for the perfect moment, a bunch of alerts chimed in all at once. Anping, you have tested all the job-exclusive skills. Anseng, you have completed the job change quest. Antheng, exit gate will be generated. And finally, it was all over. What a tough and wild ride it had been. Jin-Woo took one last look at the dungeon, and a rush of emotions hit him. Signs of epic fights were everywhere. Knights lay crushed. Walls were cracked, and a pillar was knocked over. The massive iron golem that did all that damage was now nothing more than a pile of scrap metal. But hey, he'd earned tons of loot for all the trouble he went through, and it felt totally worth it. Stepping out into the fresh air felt like a breath of fresh air. He'd scored a new job, learned fresh skills, built his own powerful army, and collected tons of cool stuff. With a grin spreading across his face, he turned away from the dungeon without looking back. The gate to the outside world stood ready, almost like it was cheering him on for making it out safely. As soon as he stepped through the gate, everything around him changed in an instant. Jin-Woo stood on that empty patch of hill where he'd accepted the job change quest. It was 5 a.m., and the first hints of sunrise were peeking over the horizon. He groaned when he checked the time way earlier than he'd hoped. If only he'd known it would take this long, he'd have given Jaina a heads up before leaving. Luckily, back in his association days, raids often ran late, so coming home after sunrise wasn't exactly new to him. He glanced over his shoulder, scanning the quiet surroundings. He spun around, but the gate he'd just stepped through had disappeared like it was never there at all. This whole situation felt super weird, almost like stepping out of a crazy video game. But no way was this just his imagination running wild. Jin-Woo pictured his troops, their armor as black as coal. No sooner had he done that than they stepped out of the shadows. At first, Jin-Woo thought they were monster shadow soldiers, creatures from the dark. But if they were monsters, then what did that make him? He smirked to himself. I guess they can call me whatever they want, he muttered under his breath. With a light step, Jin-Woo headed down the hill. Later that day, he slept until long afternoon. The sun was shining brightly by the time he fell asleep, so it wasn't surprising. Writing. His phone jolted him awake. Jin-Woo reached blindly beside his pillow, finally grabbing the phone after some effort. He answered without opening his eyes. Hello? His voice was full of sleepiness. What? Are you still sleeping? Hey, do you know what time it is? Gina's voice blasted through the phone, sounding totally shocked. He scratched his head lazily. What time is it? It's 2 in the afternoon. she said like he should have known. His eyes snapped open. He sat up and squinted at his phone to check the time. Sure enough, it was 2 p.m. Wait, are you still asleep? China sounded super worried now. Do you remember your parent-teacher meeting is today? Jin-Woo yawned and stretched, his hair sticking up everywhere. When's that again? It's at 5 o'clock. She reminded him urgently. Don't worry, I'll totally be there, he promised. Sounding more awake now. Thank goodness, Jaina said cheerfully before hanging up the phone. Jin-Woo flopped back onto his bed for a second, then slowly got up and shuffled around his room. He ran a hand through his messy hair, trying to wake himself up. If he starts getting ready now, it might get a bit stressful. After all, it's my little sister's homeroom teacher. They're in charge of her senior year of high school, the most important part of Gina's education. So I can't just throw on any old outfit, right? He opened the closet to pick out some clothes, but was hit with a stale smell. That wasn't good. Jin-Woo scratched his head. He kept digging through his clothes, but the only decent outfit he could find was this old suit he'd worn to his high school graduation. Did this even fit? When he put it on, it was just as he suspected, super tight and hard to move in. I'm definitely bigger than before. It was super obvious when he wore these old clothes. Jin-Woo's clothes were super tight, like they might rip at any second. He stood there trying to figure out what else he could possibly wear. Then his eyes landed on something important. The bank statements and checkbook Jin-Hyo had given him. These were for the account where all the money from selling essence stones went. Jin-Woo glanced back and forth between his snug outfit and the official papers in his hand. A sly grin spread across his face. It had been ages since he'd gone shopping, but before he could do that, there was one little thing he needed to handle first. Jin-Woo peeled off his tight suit and sat on the edge of the bed. He pulled up the stat window, and a bunch of words popped up in front of him.
Ping.
There was a lot to take in. Automame. Jin-Woo sung. Automatch, 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 automatch. T-sung. Under the stats section. Automatch, tuna match, automatch, 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 unknown max level, willpower LV, automatch, dagger wielding LV, automatch, 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 automatch. There were cut his tongue between his teeth as he stared at the endless list. It wasn't that long ago when this window was almost empty. Now just looking at his skills and items made his head spin. But what really caught his eye was his job title. Automat. Just yesterday it had said Nanos. And honestly, seeing that used to bug him every time he opened the stat window. This really irked Jin-Woo. Every time he checked his info screen, the words no job stared back at him. Right before that, it even said job, which made it feel extra pointed. To many people, hunters seemed like slackers when they weren't raiding. It was like seeing a deer surprised by an elk, only to be equally startled by its own reflection. Jin-Woo couldn't help but feel that twinge each time. Even though he knew it didn't mean he was unemployed, it still bugged him. But starting today, that wasn't going to be a problem anymore. Jin-Woo burst out laughing. Even though he hadn't meant to. Maybe I'm being too tough on myself. He thought, if he had been raking in the cash like other hunters, he wouldn't have cared what people thought of him when he wasn't on raids. But being a hunter wasn't something he could brag about. He was an E-rank hunter, and just staying alive was a struggle for him. Whenever he admitted, I'm an E-rank hunter, people who knew about hunters would praise him for taking on such dangerous work. But behind his back, they'd laugh at how low his rank was. This made him feel bad about himself every time he looked at his stats. Now that he had a job, or more like a special role, being a hunter was still his main gig. It's better to say that being a shadow monarch was his true specialty. Sure, it wasn't the path I'd hoped he'd take, but guess what? He didn't have any regrets at all. In fact, he felt pretty happy about how everything worked out. If Jin-Woo weren't in his room right now, he would have already summoned Igris and the other shadow soldiers. He was super curious to see just how strong they could be. If they could use 100% of their original power from when they were alive. Well, that probably wasn't possible. But thinking about it got him pumped up. Hump thump 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 went his heart as he imagined, running through all these scenarios in his head like a video game. Then he started wondering how Jin-Hyo would react to all this. Just picturing Jin-Hyo's shocked face, eyes wide, mouth hanging open, made Jin-Woo chuckle. But then an idea popped into his head. What if? Could he bring back the shadows of dead hunters too? Of course he didn't want anything bad to happen to anyone. But still, the thought was interesting. Summoning an undead warrior from someone's shadow. Just thinking about it made his skin crawl. But, what if he could grab the shadow of an A or S rank hunter? The power would be mind-blowing. If those shadow soldiers were even half as strong as they were in life, he and his army could conquer a high-rank dungeon, without breaking a sweat. Jin-Woo's heart raced with excitement. Thump, 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 but then he shook his head. Turning a human into an undead creature, that felt wrong, like crossing a big line. Whether he could do it, didn't matter. He wouldn't even consider it unless the person was super mean and deserved it. But honestly, opportunities to fight other hunters don't come around often. Even if they did, there would be a ton of problems. One important thing stood out. Humans are different from monsters and magic beasts. He nodded in agreement, feeling okay about the troops he currently had. Plus there's Igris, once a dungeon boss, a level 7 shadow soldier of knight rank. How powerful could he really be? Jin-Woo couldn't wait to find out during the next raid. He leaned over to look out the window again, and his eyes drifted to something else. Title: Wolf Assassin and one other. There's one more. Ah? Yes? Jin-Woo remembered earning a second reward after completing the job change quest. Excited, he checked out his new hidden title, The One Who Overcame Adversity. This title was given to those who triumphed over tough challenges. The best part, his stats would increase as his HP dropped 1% boost for every 1% of health lost. That was an incredible bonus that made him stronger when things got tricky. His other title, Wolf Assassin, gave him a 40% buff against animal-type monsters. But honestly, it wasn't super useful unless he was fighting those specific beasts. If there were no animals around, it felt like having no title at all. Now with his new title, Jin-Woo had a much more versatile power-up that paired perfectly with his passive skill, Willpower of. Without wasting any time, Jin-Woo switched his active title to the new one. His old title stayed hidden for now, but he could switch back whenever needed. Next up, time to check out his stats. He'd earned 3 rewards for surpassing the achievement threshold. The first upgrade boosted his class rank, the second earned him a cool new title, and the third gave him a sweet stat boost. Here's where he stood now. Stats update. Uff. Strength. Uff. 1320. Uff. Stamina. Uff. 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 Subinant. Sef. Perception. Uff. Perception. Uff. Perception. Uff. He had 10 ability points left to spend. Before, he'd always put them into agility or perception, but things were different now. He could take hits better too. Physical damage was reduced by 46%. With these points he could make his character even stronger.